At Sierra, discover great deals on top brand workout gear, like high-quality walking shoes, which might lead to another discovery.
40,000 steps, baby. Who's on top now, Karen?
You've taken the office step challenge a step too far. Don't worry, though. Sierra also has yoga gear. It might be a good place to find your zen. Discover top brands at unexpectedly low prices. Sierra, let's get moving.
Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our game-changing FlexPath learning format lets you set your own deadlines so you can learn at a time and pace that works for you. It's an education you can tailor to your schedule. That means you don't have to put your life on hold to pursue your professional goals. Instead, enjoy learning your way and earn your degree without missing a beat. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
Hello, and welcome to Outward, Slate's LGBT podcast that has proudly been available in the vernacular instead of High Latin since day one. I'm your host, Jules Gill-Peterson, and if that very cryptic opener has you scratching your head, let me tell you, we have a fabulous episode today that's going to take us back, like way back, to the era that we call early modern, to the Renaissance, to the surprisingly transgender shenanigans that Europeans were getting up to before the world got all modern. If you want to hear all of the tea about, maybe witches, sex-changing Christ figures, and more held in the manuscripts and imagery of the 16th and 17th centuries, well, honey, have I got an interview for you. I'll be chatting with Colby Gordon, who's a professor and the author of a new book, Glorious Bodies, Trans Theology and Renaissance Literature. Colby is a good friend and he's a fellow traveler of mine in the academic realm. But as devoted listeners to this show probably know, my area of expertise as a historian is 20th century America. So this is all kind of new information to me too. I'm really excited to find out about how Christianity had some very interesting divergent beliefs about sex and gender at different periods. So stick around, because after this short break, we are diving into all the tea about the demons and the angels and the miraculous divinity that is sex.
Oh, Outward listeners, here's some scoop for you. So what is it, you ask? It's that Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. Now, before anyone goes suggesting this is just rumor, know that there's actual proof this kettle of tea is not only piping hot, but 100% true. So yeah, sometimes it pays to be a little nosy, but it always pays to discover. Based on the February 2024 Nielsen report. Learn more at discover.com/creditcard.
Every idea starts with a problem. Warby Parker's was simple. Glasses are too expensive. So they set out to change that. By designing glasses in-house and selling directly to customers, they're able to offer prescription eyewear that's expertly crafted and unexpectedly affordable. Warby Parker glasses are made from premium materials like impact-resistant polycarbonate and custom acetate. And they start at just $95, including prescription lenses. Get glasses made from the good stuff. Stop by a Warby Parker store near you.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Colby Gordon is an associate professor of English at Bryn Mawr College, where he researches and teaches, among other things, Shakespeare, Renaissance literature, transgender studies, queer theory, and religion and literature. He's also the author of the book we're here to dive into today, the gloriously titled Glorious Bodies, Trans Theology and Renaissance Literature. Colby, it's always a treat to be with you. So I want to say welcome to Outward and thanks for sitting down with me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It is a total pleasure to be here. Amid all of the horrors, how nice that we get to have a little time to chat.
A little chat is always called for in the middle of horror, I do believe. Well, I thought maybe before we dig into the scintillating transgender pasts of Christianity, actually, I was wondering, could you just share, for listeners, a little about yourself? And I actually realized I don't think even I have necessarily ever heard your origin story, as a Renaissance, early modern scholar. I mean, how did you get into all this religion and literature? How did you find this calling?
We were just talking a minute ago about how the most trans experience of all is dissociation.
Yes.
And I truly feel like that has been the kind of guiding force in my own intellectual and academic career. I think it's how you wind up as a professor in the first place. If you're like, what body? I simply exist in a world of strange, obscure, archaic text. For some reason, I feel very attracted to this body of scholarship that's so divorced from everything I'm actually having to experience around me. And I just kind of floated through undergrad and then into grad school being sort of obsessed with and kind of fixated on sort of the most obscure, strange, gay little poems I could find in history. And then an even more eggish thing about me is I didn't transition until I was finishing my dissertation. That's when I started transitioning, and it had nothing to do with gender or sexuality at all. It was I was writing a dissertation about doors or something. It made no sense to anybody. What was I doing? But then I got hired in 2016 into a tenure-track job in early modern studies, and I was the first openly trans person that had ever been hired in that field. And it was coming right after the trans tipping point, and all at once, scholars of Renaissance literature and history were like, wait, trans people exist? That's interesting. I wonder if it has anything to do with the Renaissance. And sort of everyone kind of turned around and looked at me all at the same time. And I was like, okay, I guess it is now my job to figure out if there was a trans Renaissance and what that would mean and what that would look like. And so I started thinking about it, where would you go to find trans history 400 years before the development of synthetic hormones, 350 years before the development of the language of inversion and sexology? And it seemed so clear to me immediately that the way people thought about transition, about transness, about gendered embodiment in the 16th and 17th century was not medicine at all, which wasn't really even its own thing at the time. They used religion and theology to understand what transition meant and how to navigate it and what its cultural and political and social significance was. And so I started writing about all of the ways religion was this bizarre, rich, complicated, affirmative, and deeply negative repository of trans thought hundreds of years before we had to deal with people like Harry Benjamin.
Oh, I'm still hung up on that image of everyone turning around to look at you in the room because I've been there. I wrote a little book about transgender kids and everybody's been looking at me ever since. No, that's fabulous. And I'm really excited to dig into this. So, it's true. Glorious Bodies takes us back to this moment in Christianity starting before the Reformation. And, that's before the Christian church split and Protestantism and broke away from Catholicism. And it's all been, just a party ever since. But exactly, your book makes this exciting and bold argument that in this time period, which, we would call the early modern era, there is something transgender in that transitioning sort of sense of change, right? Changing sex, changing body, changing something was front and center in many religious texts and parables. And I love what you said, that it would make sense. Actually, that shouldn't really shock us because, of course, medicine as such was not really a thing. And so if you're figuring out how to do something as exciting as transition, you got to go where the culture is giving you something to do. Okay, listeners, one of the treats of this book is when you get a taste of one of these texts. And, Colby, walk us through so many of them throughout. And so I was wondering, could you start us off with an example, maybe one of your favorite texts or parables, or where we find something surprisingly transgender going on that people may not necessarily associate with either this era or just religion or Christianity to begin with?
Absolutely. And what's amazing is I am not doing any kind of strained interpretation of these texts. They're just really trans when you read them straight, right?
Yeah.
And people have known about these things for thousands of years. So one kind of consistent place that people go to when they want to think about sort of the nature of gendered embodiment is the creation of man and woman in the book of Genesis. And it turns out when Adam is created in the image of God, theologians and scholars spent a long time debating what it meant that he was created in the image of God, what that meant for the first man's gender, because Eve had to be extracted out of him physically. So, like, does that mean that before that happened, you know, in the Renaissance, in the classical period, in the medieval period, they would have called that version of Adam hermaphroditic or androgynous. But there's 2,000 years of attested conversation about whether being created in the image of God is trans. Because why would God be limited in their experience? Why would God not be able to be male and female and everything all at once? I thought we were supposed to be monotheistic, right? Like, it's starting to sound really polytheistic if God is like a man. And of course, Jesus is often represented in ways that are also understood to be incredibly transfeminine, especially at the height of the Passion during the crucifixion. Jesus is killed with the fifth wound in his side, is often represented as bleeding in a way that's kind of lactating. It's described as a form of lactation, or often it's represented as gestating the church. So sometimes Jesus is represented as like giving birth out of his side wound to the sort of personification of the church. Or maybe when we die and we're resurrected and we're given perfect bodies, glorious bodies, which is what I take the title from, saints and scholars and theologians spent years arguing about what that perfect body would mean. Maybe it means we're all going to be transitioned to male because that's the perfect form, right? Why wouldn't we be all made into men? Or maybe we'll lose our genitals altogether because they're sinful, right? And we're all going to be married to Jesus in the afterlife. So, like, what would we need those for? So truly, the kind of most sacred moments in cosmic history, according to Christian theology, keep feeling a little trans. Not just to, people like me who are looking at it wokely from a DEI perspective, to the most important canonized Christian theologians across history. So there's a true affirmative body of thought about transition and transness that was always internal to Christian theology from the beginning. It was never the party line. It was never the most important interpretation, but it was always there. And I think that's significant. It was always there for those of us who wanted it and are looking for it.
I love that. I love that you started with Genesis because, I can recall being told things about Adam and Eve, and they usually get presented these days, or, even in my lifetime, with the opposite meaning. Oh, well, because of what the book of Genesis says, there's only male and female, and they're very rigid forms, and, can't even be gay. Can't even be gay.
And that's what God wanted.
Yeah.
That's it. What a bad reading of the book of Genesis that flies in the face of thousands of years of exegesis, right? No. Binary gender is something we get at the end of two different superimposed versions of the story. And it's like both God and Adam are trying to figure out how to make gender work and how to make sexuality work. And it takes them a long time to get there. And getting to cisness, and I don't even want to call it that because I think, like you, I think that's a very recent invention, but getting to binary sexuation is the end of the process. And often people like patristic scholars like Origen and Clement of Alexandria thought that actually by the time we get distinct categories of male and female, that's actually a consequence of the fall. That's our expulsion from paradise. Having to exist in binary gender is part of the punishment for sin entering the world. Sure.
I mean,
Why
hey,
not?
has a certain cachet to it. Well, I'm curious about that because, and you said earlier moment that, okay, so these weren't not necessarily the most popular interpretations, but they were real interpretations, and that this, kind of battle or, I don't know, struggle of interpretation has been going on for a long time. And one thing I was curious about, I wonder if you could share with us, is, of course, we're going back and deep into the history of Christianity, and, Christianity, part of its success, as I understand it from a historical perspective, was, that it was tied to imperial expansion going all the way back to Rome, but that, it was not just a state religion, but it was, part of the process of incorporating people, various non-Christian peoples into, Christian political orders and social orders. And so I'm curious, like, when what you were just saying, right, that like that one interpretation, that male-female sexual differentiation is a product of the fall, and such that like divinity or the origin or what is truly, godly is a kind of fusion or plenitude of sex, right? Sexes or whatnot. So is this also part of the story of how Christianity has incorporated, like, for lack of a better phrase, and you tell me, like pagan beliefs or other belief systems, older belief systems that have actually not necessarily been erased, but actually were incorporated, carried, and sort of like infused into the Christian tradition? Is that part of where all this good trans comes in?
That's such an interesting way of phrasing this question. And I think what you actually see is that there's a real profound ambivalence internal to Christianity itself about its own transness and about its own past, about its the Jewishness of its initial, of the text that it has sort of taken in and reworked, but also about the boundaries that separate Christianity from everything else. And in the early modern period, those religious differences are increasingly being understood as racial differences, as hereditary and unassimilable within Christianity itself. So on the one hand, you read all of these texts and you're like, wow, Jesus seems incredibly trans in these moments, right? Our resurrection is going to transition us. Fascinating. Adam and Eve and the image of God, incredibly trans moments. But Christianity was also understanding itself as distinct from entire racialized populations that it understood to be unassimilable to Christianity precisely because of their gender variance. So, for instance, Jews were understood to be trans in a number of ways. We might say, so Jewish men were understood to menstruate as punishment for their participation in killing Christ. Obviously, Muslims were understood to be gender variant. There was a lot of confusion about circumcision, which was read as castration. And of course, the Ottoman court did indeed produce many eunuchs at the time. So there were ways that transness is internal to Christianity and simultaneously its limit. And what I think you see happening over and over again since the early modern period, when these kinds of discourses are becoming racialized, is that Christianity has struggled mightily to purge itself of its own transness, to disavow it and project it onto racialized populations that can never be included in the community.
Well, I don't usually teach the deep, long history of racism, but I remember even taking courses in that actually when I was a college student. And it was so interesting to learn because I think, maybe kind of the general perception that people might get depending on, where you went to public school and whatnot. It's like, okay, like racism, obviously has a political history in colonialism, in transatlantic slave trade, right? And maybe like a scientific history in the 19th century, like scientific racism, back when they were making all these claims about different human races. But when you go back even further, a lot of European forms of racism in particular emerged in religious context, and religious and political context, right? And in that idea that there are certain groups of people and there's something different about them, in their being, right? I mean, I certainly didn't know how much sex, right? How much people's sexual bodies played into the definition of this like very early modern idea of racial difference as religious difference. I mean, that's sort of so exciting how it all, well, exciting in an intellectual sense, but how it all comes together there. Yeah.
Well, it begins to feel quite modern in certain respects, even as it feels so different. Like we're seeing the emergence of various kinds of categories of racialized being. And it's interesting that you mentioned conversion, because certainly the 16th and 17th century were times of a massive violent pushes for conversion, both within Europe and outside of Europe as part of colonial projects. You see it in every way. Forced conversions, all of the different kinds of pressures to convert, expulsion of Jewish and Muslim populations from places like Spain. And at the same time, you see increasingly a real anxiety about whether it's even possible to convert in the first instance, or whether there's something internal to who you are, something inborn that makes it impossible for you to convert. And there is also a real fear that Christians are converting out of Christianity and therefore possibly even out of whiteness. It was not uncommon for Christians to convert to Islam. There was a good pitch for that, you know. It made a lot of sense to people. And one of the things that you see happening is organizations like the Inquisition are so concerned about crypto-Jews and crypto-Muslims and people converting from Christianity to other religions that they start doing things like mandating genital examinations. And boy, if that does not just feel as though we are living in the long afterlives of inquisitorial genital examinations, right? Which again, the kinds of genital exams that are being mandated by state legislatures constantly today both feel very early modern to me in the way they're understanding gendered embodiment, but also, as we know, tend to target people of color who are understood to be gender variant already. So you see that kind of convergence of this religious vocabulary of a kind of like proto-racism getting inserted into anti-trans politics today. And I have to say, as someone who studies the 16th and 17th centuries for a living, it feels incredibly familiar to me, all of these tools and tactics. It's like we have reverted to this early modern moment of Reformation and Counter-Reformation where everyone is so concerned about making sure everyone's gender is doing what it's supposed to. And if that's not happening, then it becomes a matter of state violence and discipline, and sort of the bureaucratic structure of the state has to be brought down on anyone who might be violating.
You know, I don't know what anyone listening, what your sense of like a long time ago is. You know, if I was like, how long is a long time ago? What chunk of time would you throw up? But for historians, like 100 years is a sneeze, right? So the 16th and 17th century, oh, it's not that long ago. Well, that was yesterday. But I think often what we mean when we say that is like things that were really live then, as you were just saying, didn't necessarily peter out. I mean, there's been a lot of PR, a lot of narrative. We had the Enlightenment, we had all the American Revolution, we had modernity, we have industrial capitalism. Surely we're not still working on some stuff there, but it seems like we very much
full
still
Inquisition.
Are. Yeah, full
Absolutely
Inquisition. She's still out there.
Still kicking, I swear. Yeah.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, I am going to ask Colby Gordon the $1 million question about transgender Jesus Christ.
I can't wait.
The Jack Welch Management Institute at Strayer University helps you go from, I know the way, to I've arrived with our top 10 ranked online MBA. Gain skills you can learn today and apply tomorrow. Get ready to go from make it happen to made it happen. And keep striving. Visit strayer.edu/Jack Welch MBA to learn more. Strayer University is certified to operate in Virginia by Chev and has many campuses, including at 2121 15th Street North in Arlington, Virginia.
Hey, it's Anna Sale, host of Death, Sex, and Money. 5 years ago, I talked to a listener we called Ethan, who said that our show had inspired him to cheat on his wife with sex workers.
I was a little bit intrigued after listening to the DSM podcast. And so I went on and started looking around and started, talking with people here and there.
Did you have sex?
Yeah.
I recently called Ethan back to see how he's been since and what it was like after we stopped recording.
I left the studio, I biked home, and I sat in the shower and I cried.
At Death, Sex, and Money, we tell personal stories that are real, and we stay in touch with our guests and listeners because we know that the first ending of a story isn't the only ending. We change, and the stories change. Sometimes, like in this case, because of one conversation. You can listen along and get Death, Sex, and Money wherever you find your podcasts.
And we're back. So, Colby, you alluded to this earlier. And, I have a vague sense as someone who has watched my Discovery Channel documentaries about the ancient world in the evenings while I'm relaxing with a little THC or something, having a nice time. I have the vague sense that Jesus Christ has been depicted in many different forms. I mean, truly going back clearly thousands of years. And as you were talking about earlier, but as your book discusses, some of them are, as the girls used to say back in the 1960s, kind of transy.
Absolutely, yeah.
You mentioned one or two, but can you tell us more? Because I'm not trying to be a godless, sacrilegious girl right now. I'm actually genuinely very interested. Like, why? What are some of these depictions? And again, why would Jesus, not by us here in 2025, but by people hundreds of years ago, why would they have depicted Jesus in ways that blended male and female? Like, what is that about? Like, what's the purpose?
I think that often as trans people, it is very difficult for us, even when we're scholars and historians of transness, it's hard for us to think about transition outside of a medical vocabulary for what it might mean. But if we try really hard to do it, the kinds of questions that are raised by transition are philosophical and metaphysical and ethical and social, and they go so far beyond secular reason and medical science, and I think that theology is a place that people went to ask important questions about what bodies could do, about what they were, about what they meant. And the incarnation was a really fascinating place for people to think through some of those paradoxes of embodiment, of what it would mean to have a body that was transcendent and material at the same time, and suffering, but also glorious. And so you see these kinds of contradictions getting worked out in the incarnated body of Jesus in ways that, to me, move directly into the kinds of stakes of transition. So Jesus's body, it moves through the world in a strange way. It takes on new, exciting shapes all the time. And at the kind of height of its sacred potential, in the history of salvation, when it's being crucified, the ways that it opens up feel really trans. They felt to people in the early modern period as quite maternal, as giving birth to something new, a new world, a new people, a new way of being. Often in visual representations of the crucified Christ, people are sort of like licking and sucking the blood in ways that are both intensely erotic and sexual, and people have been writing about this for a long time, but that are also kind of childlike. So a lactating Christ who's sort of bleeding and feeding the followers who are drinking his blood as part of communion, right? It felt trans to people. And again, I am not doing anything except reading the thing that it says. I sometimes joke that I practice the trans method of reading what it says. And it is harder to do a cis reading of the incarnation than it is to do a trans reading. It's just right there.
Ooh, that's a great way of putting it. Well, and you just said it felt to people like it was trans. And I want to ask for some guidance on who those people are, right? Because, one of the challenges I imagine of studying a period so long ago is what sources are available, right? You know that in early modern Europe, there was a class of people, scholastic-minded people, scholars, monks, and so on. Maybe their jobs were to copy manuscripts, that these were, in some sense, rarefied. But then, on the other hand, religion is a really popular form. And I wondered, could more common people encounter things like that, in a visual form if they weren't able to read and write and they weren't part of this rarefied class, maybe in a church? Or I'm kind of curious about possibilities here for understanding, like, who are those people to whom these things felt trans, like the elite version, maybe, so to speak, and also the common version. What do you know about that?
What a good question. And I think you've touched on so many of the different possible avenues for accessing some of these histories and texts and ideas. And it's interesting to study a post-Reformation period because cheap print really changes things for Christianity.
Yeah.
So there would have been, and the ability to access scripture in the vernacular in a way that was made increasingly possible after the 16th century would have meant that you would have been able to have more people with more access to these stories. But of course, the visual representations, the lush, rich visual representations in Catholic churches often are so queer and so gender variant. They would have been available to anyone who walked in. And I think that possibility, like you said, of just being really interested in the saints. Oh, these saints who keep praying so hard to not have to get married, and then Jesus gives them a beard. That's amazing.
Thank you, Jesus.
Right? Or they're having sort of martyrological mastectomies. How amazing. I'm just really focused on the saints. Maybe I should join an order of some kind. Listen, we wound up as professors today, but 500 years ago, we might have had completely fine lives, in some kind of religious order or something. Again, sort of communing with these ideas, just being really interested in them and really invested in them. Entirely possible.
It's easy to understand a kind of philosophical tradition of debate and discussion around texts as I'm sure people debated these things, but to also remember that it's not just abstract, that involved, real people's lives, which brings me to maybe, I want to bring our conversation, at the risk of making it a little bit about the present, as a way of bringing our conversation to a close today. In the introduction to your book, you challenge scholars, people who work in this field, transgender studies, to reevaluate its unspoken commitment to secularity. And I love that. And I think it's actually a much more, it's a big challenge for everyone. And I don't think people talk that much about this, right? That there's a kind of assumption that transgender has to be a modern secular thing. And some of that, I think, obviously comes from the fact that, if you Google transgender and Christianity today, a lot of the hits are going to make you see like, okay, well, these things can't go together. Or if you want them to go together, you must be really straining against tradition. But more broadly, right, the idea that transition, being trans, is always separate from any religious tradition, any religious practices, any spiritual practices, right? I think if you ask a lot of people, they'll be like, yeah, I don't like that division. But what do you think in this moment, right? When certainly several interpretations of Christianity are being mobilized and are powering not just political attacks on trans people, but also just sort of setting the terms of the so-called political debate, right, for the public. What to you lies on the other side of questioning this secular consensus? What rewards you've shared a lot of very interesting possible rewards already, I think, but like if you really wanted to kind of share with our listeners, like who might even feel like, oh, I don't know, like this is all really interesting, but like, why should we go there? Why should we lean into the Christianity of it all? I think there are good reasons to. I'd love to hear what you think some of them are.
There's no reason to do any of this kind of work right now if we lose an eye to the political crises that we're inhabiting and trying to survive at this moment. So this is something I actually think about a lot. And I don't think we're going to save the world with religious literature from the English Renaissance. I don't think that's a real possibility. But I have two answers to that question that sort of I come back to again and again. And the first maybe is the smaller or less important answer, but I think trans people should have everything. And that includes religion, and that includes the Renaissance. And I don't think that we all should be religious, especially if the religion we're talking about is Christianity, which again is caught up in so many of these processes of, the histories of fascism and white supremacy and racialization and turning religious categories into racial categories. But I do think there are a lot of trans people who are and want to be religious, and I want them to have access to that if they want it. And what they do with it is none of my business. But if that is a thing that I can contribute to giving them, then I want to be able to do it. But I think there's a broader political question at stake here. And that is to say, if secularism was going to save us, then we should do it. But it's not. It's not working. We meaning trans people and trans activists, I suppose, tend to hide behind the endorsements of doctors and psychologists and medical professionals and the American Medical Association and the American Psychiatric Association. And we recite the names of these organizations like a kind of defensive litany that's going to protect us from state violence. And it doesn't. It has not. That is a strategy that has failed. And we are both interested and invested in the history of sexology and the sexual sciences. And so you and I know from long experience what poor allies doctors are, how vicious they are towards trans people, how they build their own careers by discoursing on our strange perversions in bodies and creating new and exciting taxonomies for us. And even though some of that, certainly not all, but some of that has sort of faded behind a veneer of respectability politics for doctors and professionals who work in trans health, it's still there, and it doesn't work. So I feel like we are leaving money on the table when we say trans people can only be understood through the conceptual vocabulary of medical science because doctors say that we're good and right and normative and we just want to be regular and we just want to be productive citizens of American empire and we can contribute and labor and be in the military. I think that's a mistake. Why did we walk away from the unbelievably powerful discourse of religion? I think that there is something to be gained, if only to say that we do not have to understand transness through the categories provided for us by doctors and physicians who continue to think that we are disordered and unreliable narrators of our own experience and gatekeeping us, even if just to say, there is another way to think about trans life outside of the hospital, outside of the gender identity clinic. We need it. And religion is one place we can think about that.
Woo! Well, I felt that in my bones and my spirit.
Testifying.
So beautifully said. And as is often the case when we talk to authors on this show, we run out of time before we can even scratch the surface of what's so interesting about a book. But if that didn't sell listeners, I don't know what will. Glorious Bodies, Trans Theology and Renaissance Literature is available wherever you get your fine books. So go out and get this fine book. And I just want to say, Colby, thank you for taking the time to walk us through some fascinating deep history, but also thank you, dare I say, for taking us to some kind of church. I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, that is all for the main show today, but there's always more Outward over in the Slate Plus feed. And this week, Colby is going to stick around, help us update our gay agenda. So if you're not already a subscriber, remember that by joining Slate Plus, you'll get ad-free podcasts, extra segments in all our shows, and you'll never hit a paywall on the Slate site. You can subscribe now on Apple Podcasts by clicking Try Free at the top of the Outward show page, or visit slate.com/Outward Plus to get access wherever you listen. As always, we'd love to get your feedback. Hear any topic ideas you might have or any other comments you want to make, drop us a line over at outwardpodcast@slate.com. Our show is produced by the truly divine Palace Shaw. If you like Outward, do subscribe in whatever podcast app you use. Let your friends know about it. Rate and review this little old show so that other people can find their way to it. In the meantime, say your prayers and stay gay.